All right, perfect. So today, really the point of this presentation, calling it cyber fitness, and really the goal and the takeaway is to have this focus on becoming more resilient for your cyber program, and then hopefully, also increasing your ability to also become insurable. Because most of the things that the carriers are focused on are really where they're seeing the most risk. So what kind of security controls, what kind of regulatory issues, and then what are the what some of the like the actual challenges also that we're seeing in the marketplace. So my name is Lacy Rex, and I'm with Oswald Companies. I'm our cyber strategic leader, so I focus entirely on cyber and technology errors and emissions for our clients. It's been a really challenging past couple of years. I don't know if any of you are involved in actually placing insurance, but the landscape has changed drastically, and there's a lot of focus on cybersecurity now. So, just a little bit of background on me. I've been doing this for about 15 years now. I recently wrapped up a program at Carnegie Mellon in cybersecurity. So it's something we're very passionate about. And if there's any questions, I would say go ahead and ask. Chances are if you have them, there's going to be other folks that are also going to be thinking the same thing. And I think it just makes it a little bit more interesting if there's dialogue. So don't hesitate to just shout out and we can obviously go through those. So agenda for today is really going to be focused on, what you should know around cybersecurity, what's sort of going on. I'm going to touch briefly upon what is cyber insurance, and then cybersecurity controls. So looking at best practices and the actual carrier expectations right now, because that certainly has changed. And then also what you should be doing, hopefully. So that's going to be the general format. So, cyber insurance is an important part of risk transfer. It's not the only thing that an organization should be doing as far as securing your network, but it's obviously going to make any organization more resilient, and obviously more stability in the long run, having that coverage. So here's just a quick overview of what cyber liability insurance is. At the heart, it's first party and it's third party coverage, so not super complicated. The first party would be notification costs. I'm assuming everyone in this presentation has unfortunately received some sort of notification with credit monitoring. If you've been affected, maybe they're offering credit restoration services, or may involve attorneys, things like that. So it's going to respond to those costs, and then the actual disaster recovery incident response firms coming in, remediating. It's going to be a business income loss as a result of an incident. Could be malicious attack or it could be non-malicious, and then a third party going down and affecting an organization's ability to provide services as well. It's also going to provide coverage for that restoration. Typically, we find that if there's an incident that happens, it could actually bring operational technology offline, maybe make it so the device can no longer even be restored. It needs to be completely replaced, which is called bricking. We also find that just the data and the investigation, there can be forensic accounting costs that can be included and things like that. And then the third party, that would be liability. It would be privacy and security matters. So if you had an HR person that inadvertently sent malicious information to, employees, or W-2 information to someone outside the organization, things like that. So again, it's first party, third party, not terribly complicated. There's a lot of nuances there, but that's sort of an overview of the coverage. And then they will also respond to regulatory fines and penalties where insurable by law. So we're seeing quite a dynamic increase in privacy related matters across the country, just with the focus on securing data, whether it's biometric or, personally identifiable information, really focusing on the privacy matters itself. So what we're seeing right now, and kind of where hopefully everyone has a takeaway, is what's driving the shift in the past 2 years with cyber insurance. Why are we seeing so much more scrutiny around it? It's really primarily being driven by the ransomware epidemic that we've experienced. So the increase in claims, it did not slow down. Anything escalated during COVID and lockdown. And what we found is a lot of organizations weren't doing some of the basic things that they need to do to secure. Multi-factor authentication is something that I'm going to talk about later in the presentation. But what we found is both the severity and the frequency of the situation really dramatically went up. It was something where, typically when our clients have some sort of claim, it's going to be a limit loss, unfortunately. There's also concerns over supply chain and systemic risk. If you think about it in terms of really being that tipping point with SolarWinds in December of 2020, where they had a very sophisticated supply chain attack, where they actually embedded malicious software and code into a security update patch to their clients. So you have a patch from a trusted vendor, and unfortunately, there was numerous organizations that were affected. Same thing with situations like Kaseya, where they really focus on managed service providers. And it was a very sophisticated attack there as well, and it affected 1,600 of their downstream clients. I can kind of just rattle off a bunch like Blackbaud, a bunch of these others, but they found that if they go after the technology provider, they're going to be affecting all their downstream clients. So it really has a ripple effect, and a lot of the carriers are concerned about it. We talk about supply chain, we talk about it in terms of maybe products not being able to leave port, or it's not able to get, and we have limitations to actually getting the end product to where it needs to go. Same thing really applies to cyber. If you think about it, if there's a manufacturer that creates an essential type of product that a lot of organizations rely upon to get their end product out the door, if they're hit with ransomware, or they have an unplanned or unanticipated outage, that kind of system failure coverage, the property policy wouldn't respond. It would actually be a cyber policy because it's a non-physical business interruption. So that ripple effect and that potential business interruption cost really just escalates and creates a lot of uncertainty for folks. And then social engineering claims. Business email compromise continues to be one of the biggest issues that we see. Obviously, the hackers are trying to monetize whatever they can. So they're going to gate access. Typically, they're going to lie in wait. They're going to begin exfiltrating data, trying to find sensitive information. And then, obviously, they're also going to try and steal money. They're going to try and intercept a large payment, manipulate an invoice that's going out the door, or something of that nature. So unfortunately, these things happen quite often. It can be really devastating for organizations and cost millions of dollars for the social engineering type of claims as well. So as far as costs, what we found last year, especially, was we hit a lot of records, not necessarily great records, though. One of the largest ransomware payouts made by an insurance company at $40 million, setting a world record. It probably wasn't the largest payment ever, but the most publicized that everyone really knew about. From what I understand, it was also really challenging just to obtain that amount of Bitcoin as well. If you think about how it actually needs to be paid and the facilitation of it. The most common attacks are the email phishing campaigns, remote desktop or RDP vulnerabilities, and software vulnerabilities. Those kind of systemic vulnerabilities where that information is maybe it's not being patched, or maybe there's similar to Log4j, where you've got something where there's an inherent vulnerability in software and it's code that's in almost everything. And also the average increase and the average cost increased 10% year over year. So the costs continue to escalate. Typically, the disaster recovery incident response costs are the most expensive that we see. It's not necessarily the attorneys, it's going to be the actually cyber forensics folks. So I won't make you guys respond to this, but I don't know if anyone has a guess as to what the average number of days a ransomware incident lasts. So it's really from when it begins to when the system's back up and running. And the answer is actually 22 days. So just according to Codeware, they're a ransomware negotiation firm. So really all they do is help organizations work with the bad actors, facilitate Bitcoin payment, and help go through OFAC checks, things like that, make sure the information is accurate. And it's interesting because they can actually track in real time and help their clients understand, what is this track record of this bad actor? How long do we anticipate it's going to take? If we pay, will we be able to get our decryption keys? Will they work? We have actually had experiences with bad actors, and maybe the decryption keys weren't working fully, or there were some challenges, and they actually do provide customer service to help get back up and running. So it is a business, and they do treat it as such. So what we're seeing right now from the insurance carriers, and it's really being driven by the types of claims that they're seeing. So we're starting to see them utilizing things like co-insurance. It can be up to 50%. So it can be quite, very aggressive, and a lot of out-of-pocket costs, especially when you're talking about policies that are millions of dollars. The rate increases. It really depends on the organization and profile. We've had some that were less than 20% this year, but on average, I would say we're looking at 60 to 150 plus increases. Especially anyone that hasn't renewed, that renewed later than July 1st, for instance. We're still seeing some market corrections. We're starting to see new exclusions too, things like neglected software. So maybe not patching, end-of-life technology, maybe not addressing common vulnerability exploits that are higher than, a certain amount from a scoring standpoint, not being addressed in a timely manner. We're starting to see where there's supplements or just exclusions for that. And also supplements for cyber extortion. So that would be anything that would fall within ransomware. Limiting of that dependent business interruption, a lot of concerns again around supply chain. And then it's a really rigorous underwriting process. So we're starting to see, scanning technology, phone calls. It's a really heavy lift and a lot of data required. Things like Log4j questions and warranties. And it's not only for our clients' environments, but it's for everyone that they're working with, and third-party data that they're entrusting to as well.
Hey, Lacy, can you speak to, that was one thing for my transition from my previous job to this job, and how we're dealing with kind of those middle market customers as well as some large global clients. Can you talk about, I found it interesting that we spend time walking through this process with our clients, where at my previous job it was kind of just fill the question out like you did last year with no regard for modification. Can you kind of speak to what we do there, or how you do it? What's different than the big firms?
Yeah. So, and unfortunately, I've seen this happen quite often, is get the applications back, you go out to market, controls aren't there, understanding compensating controls, or the question wasn't answered correctly. So when we get the applications in, we review them, and then anything that's concerning or potentially answers that are going to be challenging for the underwriting process, what we'll do is we'll go through that, discuss it with the clients, because we want to be able to have a story to tell. So what kind of compensating controls do you have? Walk through that. I had, there was a large manufacturer that I was talking to on the East Coast, and they were working with a large broker. They didn't really give them any kind of concrete guidance as to what was going on in the marketplace and what are the hot button points really. And they had a really challenging renewal, and they actually had a lapse in coverage too.
Yeah, I think for the group here in general, this isn't a sales pitch for Oswald, but it is a sales pitch to go back and talk to your security team and make sure that they're getting the support from their broker where it's necessary, right? So as you're moving into these more dynamic times, you really need to have a partner who's assisting you with identifying changes in the market and how you're best suited, or how you're best positioned to get coverage, because we've also had coverages that are dropped, unfortunately. So it's a really important piece of this presentation as a takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, knock on wood, I haven't had any clients yet that we weren't able to secure coverage for, but I have had several folks tell me that they weren't able to secure coverage. I can tell you that starting early is really important, and talking through controls, where are you at this moment, having regular check-ins too with CISOs. Okay, this is really what hot button point, how do we prioritize, is really so critical. And being prepared is really essential to actually obtaining the best terms and conditions too in this marketplace. So it's certainly, I would say, it's a pretty heavy lift right now. Excuse me. And if they're not doing it, then it's going to be almost impossible to obtain coverage. But going through the application, because you bring up a good point too, David, the application becomes part of the policy. So if there are any inconsistencies with the responses, I don't think clients do anything nefarious. I don't think that's the intent to mislead on the application. But if you don't understand fully the question, then there can be some ambiguity. So really, I always encourage an addendum to the application to become part of it, a policy, or become part of it to clarify. Because I oftentimes find that, especially with IT folks, it's really difficult to get a yes or no answer. It's usually somewhere in between. So really adding some context, understanding compensating controls is really critical. So one of the things I talked about earlier was multi-factor authentication. So it's 2 or more authenticating factors that you have to do prior to actually gaining access to a network. Everyone's been using multi-factor authentication for years. If you think about it in terms of your debit card, it's something you know, and it's something you have, which is your PIN. So your debit card and your PIN, it's going to be your multi-factor authentication. So really where the insurance carriers want to see this utilized is either for a password or passphrase, or it can be a token or smart card. So it could be something physical that you actually use, or it could be a biometric type of thing, like, if you have an iPhone or some other type of a smartphone, it could be facial recognition, could be thumbprint, something like that. So where should an organization use multi-factor authentication? I'm really going to focus on 3 different areas. It's certainly not all encompassing. It's kind of a trick question. It's everywhere you possibly can. So through email, what they want to see is on when you're accessing on a non-corporate device. So it could be some sort of tablet, it could be your smartphone, that you're using multi-factor authentication to authenticate. I would also encourage, if everyone's just using a 4-digit passcode, I would increase it to 6 digits. Because you just want to make it as secure as possible. It's going to reduce a threat actor's ability to actually gain access because they're going to have that authenticating step. Text messaging, that kind of SMS text messaging, it's not considered as secure as a third-party application. There's a lot of different providers out there, but applications tend to be considered more secure. Phone calls, also not considered quite as secure unless you're putting in codes or identification. We're starting to see where the bad actors are really focusing on getting someone to accept an authentication that they didn't initiate. So really, really thinking about it in those terms. But it's going to prevent from gaining access and confidential information being taken. So also remote access. Hopefully, if you're remotely connecting to your network, you're using a virtual private network or a VPN. So if you're gaining access to the VPN, you want to make sure there's multi-factor authentication. Same steps you would go through with authenticating a new device or smartphone. You're going to want to do that as well. It's going to prevent a third party, threat actor from gaining access and making changes, moving laterally, intercepting financial payments, things like that. Pardon me. So really just any kind of remote access is really critical. And then remote access to the network while you're a privileged user. So what we mean by that is anyone that has administrative rights or enhanced privileges, even within their own trusted network, they need to authenticate that it really is them. There should really be kind of 2 sets of two sets of credentials, one being kind of a traditional user's credential, and the other one being one that has more enhanced privileges. So even within your own trusted environment, if they're making a change to the firewall, if they're accessing backups, things like that, they should be authenticating. So another area too that I mentioned earlier is the end-of-life technology. So end-of-life technology would be, it could be a physical piece of machinery. or it could be software, anything like that, where it's reached the end of its support by the manufacturer. So no longer any patching. It's essentially it's a vulnerability for the organization. So end of life technology is a potential area for an organization or a threat actor to exploit to gain access. So running anything that's unpatched really leaves your organization open to vulnerabilities and to be exploited by these bad actors. So what we found too is end of life technology, sometimes if it's a piece of machinery or something like that, if it is affected by ransomware, it's especially vulnerable to being able to be restored. And you may need to just replace it, and it may be a very complicated process. So making those investments in end of life technology to make sure it's completely, it's being decommissioned when it needs to be, or what are the additional protections and layers that their organization has. There's something called air gaps, so not connected to the internet, but then how are you preventing anyone from physically approaching the device and say putting a USB drive in? So thinking about it in those terms. Excuse me. Cybersecurity training and awareness. I find this is probably one of the simplest things and oftentimes overlooked. So we're thinking about kind of bang for your buck, this and multi-factor authentication are those areas that are really important to focus on. I was talking to someone from Beasley Insurance not that long ago, and they said roughly 60% of the claims that they see are actually coming from employees. So, thinking about it in terms of that human firewall is really critical, and that good cyber hygiene. So I want to make sure that you're, doing training at least on a yearly basis, and then doing the phishing simulations and training at least monthly is really what the insurance carriers want to see. It's just good, good best practices really for any organization. So making sure that you're running it, they understand how to look for, and just really be a little bit more defensive, either, while they're on social media or, just doing their day-to-day operations. I found too that oftentimes it's really difficult for a lot of organizations to understand what data do they have. So confidential information, especially if you're, looking at acquisitions or something like that, or just confidential data on your clients or vendors, personal identifiable information or PII, personal health information, if you have any of that data, or PHI. There's other things that fall in that category, like biometric data, and also payment card information, PCI data would fall into that. Really understanding what does that universe look like, and then also what is your document retention policy. So how long do you need to keep it? And if you're outsourcing any function to a third party, what are they going to do with that data? So looking at the contracts and really understanding what are the ramifications long term, and how can you transfer that risk? So when you look at the contracts, having that, what are they going to do with the data after the termination of the project? Are they carrying any kind of cyber insurance coverage? If so, what is the limit? What are they able to add you as additional insured? All that good stuff is really important. At the end of the day, though, you are outsourcing the function, not necessarily the liability. If that third-party data center or software company has an incident, more than likely their limit's going to be really consumed by their own loss. And unfortunately, I've had quite a few clients that have had third parties data in their care, custody, and control, and the third party had an incident, and all their responsibility is to notify our client, not to notify all of our clients' clients. So it really becomes quite messy. And that's why, obviously vendor contracts and that diligence around that process is so critical. But at the end of the day, just making sure that you understand what is your universe, what is all the information that they're storing, and having the right policies and procedures in place. There's a lot of concern right now around biometric data. The BIPA, so the Biometric Information Protection Act in Illinois, is really one that we've seen some really large class action lawsuits come out of it. Unfortunately, we've had some clients that have gotten caught up in it as well, but it's capturing that data, getting the right authentication or the right consent forms, and obviously storing that data. What's the record retention policy? Really just understanding the ramifications around that as well. And then obviously you want to understand how much data that you have. Obviously it affects notification costs if you need to. Are you legally required to carry the data? Does it need to be in an active system, or can it be on an encrypted network that's stored offline? Really understanding, what's the best policies and procedures around that. And then, really a complete data review is critical, in understanding what are those ramifications and what are you contractually obligated to carry as well. I know that we're going to talk about it later in a different session, so I won't spend too much time on it. Incident response plans, obviously, these are really critical in a moment that can be incredibly stressful and challenging. So make sure you have a hard copy of it, and it should be a living, breathing document as well. Most of the insurance carriers want it to specifically address ransomware. So making sure that your playbook, your incident response plan addresses that. Any kind of third-party resources that you would need or want to contact in the event that you have that situation. So the Privacy Council, digital forensics technology, understanding who your insurance carrier is. Do you have a broker that can help, crisis management firm, things like that? Having all that contact information along with the contacts and the alternates for the internal folks as well, because people will go on vacation, they may not be available. To really understand that. And it should be enterprise wide. It shouldn't obviously just be, it's not an IT issue. It's going to be affecting the entire organization if something happens. Understanding the reporting requirements for the insurance carrier. Most of them, in order to really kind of move forward, they need consent. So obtaining that is really critical. And then make sure it's obviously written and formal and documented. It should be somewhere between, a cocktail napkin and a 100-page document. So it's really not a one-size-fits-all document for all organizations. And it should be annually tested at least. Obviously we have fire drills for a reason. It just makes you more cyber resilient and ready and prepared. That kind of cyber fitness and being focused on that is really critical for any organization. Most of the insurance carriers are asking this question too. Are you at least annually testing your incident response plan? They're asking, do you have a business continuity plan? And really, what does that process look like? And they just know that it needs to be holistic and it needs to be something that is practiced and that kind of really to trickle that muscle memory, so to speak. So talked about multi-factor authentication. Talked about the training and really how technology affects the ability to obtain insurance, but some other things to think about: network segmentation as well. So having it configured, so if they do gain access, they can't move laterally and affect multiple systems and really wreak havoc upon the network. So network segmentation is really important. One of the things that the insurance carriers really like to understand is something called zero trust. It's a framework essentially, and it's really what it sounds like. Not really trusting anything, everyone, and anything entering the network really considered, not trustworthy, and really thinking about everything defensively. Also with the intent of really kind of preventing any lateral movement. For a lot of organizations, it's a complete restructuring of the cybersecurity framework, but it's what the insurance carriers really like to hear. Patch management process as well. So really, what's the time frame? What are critical patches? So those that need to be addressed within a few days, if not hours. What's that process look like? How do you escalate it? How do you become diligent with that process and make sure that you're following it? Also back to network segmentation, the least privilege. So if you are, if you're someone who is part of HR, obviously you're going to need access to more data, but you shouldn't need access to all the financial information that somebody in the accounting department would need, for instance. So really, least privilege for everyone, and it really just kind of limits the ability. So if someone does gain access to credentials, their ability to actually, gain more access, intercept financials, and things like that. The other thing that they like to see too, I haven't added here, is really thinking about it in terms of penetration testing of the network, or it's also called pen testing. So it can be considered in a couple different ways. Usually whenever you have a big system migration, there should be pen testing done. It's both an external and then an internal, where they send you a device and try and see how much what kind of lateral movement that they could obtain. The external would be gaining access, but there's other types too. There's where it's actually physical pen testing. So they try and gain access to your facility and see how far they can go. They may drop like USB drives or something and label them, executive compensation, really trying to test the employees to see if they would pick that USB drive up and plug it into their computers. And then there's also social media pen testing. So it can be quite extensive, and it's essentially what the bad actors do. So they gain access, they're going to do research through LinkedIn, build up, an idea of what that person, their behaviors, and really target the phishing to them. It could also be something as simple as calling and, purporting to be from, say, Duo help desk, and needing to migrate your multi-factor authentication profile. Okay, perfect, wonderful, here we are, and just accept that authentication push that you got. Great. And then they have access to the network. So really having employees thinking defensively too, in terms of if there was no authentication initiation, they probably shouldn't just click OK. Unfortunately, we do see that happening. So encryption of the data too. So they do gain access that, is it usable data? So it should be encrypted in transit at rest, and with the backups as well. So, backups are a big area of focus for insurance carriers, because they want to know if someone does compromise your network, will they be able to also compromise your backups and make it so that they're no longer usable? So one of the buzzwords is immutable. They ideally want to understand if you're using a third-party service to back them up. What is that? How often? Is there multi-factor authentication to protect it? Is the data encrypted? So they do gain access. They really can't do anything with it. So really, and then also encryption should be on any kind of portable devices as well. So what type of, if they do gain access to your laptop, it can be considered safe harbor in a lot of states, from what I understand. I'm not an attorney, but it can be a safe harbor if it is encrypted. So really, there are some simple things that can be done to help protect and make every organization a little bit more cyber resilient. There's also endpoint detection and response. So it's essentially artificial intelligence, and it goes beyond antivirus to detect anomalies, things that are new, kind of zero-day vulnerabilities that aren't known, help detect and actually stop and remediate them as well. You can outsource it to a managed provider, and that's called Managed Endpoint Detection Response, or MDR. And then we have some clients also, having a 24/7 security operations, or SOC, to actually monitor is really considered also good best practices. There's also something called a privileged access management tool, where it essentially keeps all of the passwords and keeps the username and logins for those sort of enhanced privileges. So they would need to have, that special privileged access to gain access to that tool. There's still multi-factor authentication. So again, layered security is really the goal. So having that multi-factor authentication to hopefully prevent them from gaining access to email. If they do gain access to email or the network, they can't move laterally to someone who has enhanced privileges, because they're going to be stopped by another layer. So really, layered security and testing of the process is really critical to hopefully every organization just becoming more cyber resilient. And I feel like it's been mentioned to death, but it's not if, it's when. But I think there should be another part to it. It's not if, it's not if, it's when, and it's also how often will you be compromised and how resilient will you be. So I think at the end of the day, that's absolutely critical and important for every organization to really be able to weather that storm, so to speak. Because we're seeing this play out. I was reading an article this morning where there's now a security action against Okta because of a third-party vendor that they had entrusted data to was compromised. And Okta is a multi-factor authentication provider. So that information was compromised. From what I understand, it was a very small amount of the actual of users that were affected in comparison to their overall large data that they have. But at the same time, we've seen where a stock price drops as a result and things like that. So can have a direct ripple effect when there is a cyber liability incident, and how it affects the organization as a whole, and really kind of more that cyber resiliency. I don't know if there's any questions, but if not, nearing the end of my presentation. So, I would say as far as what needs to be done now, really to prepare, kind of everything that I've talked about is really considered best practices, but it's considered best practices from the insurance carriers because there's a direct correlation to the type of claims that they're seeing. One other area that I did not mention was there's a lot of focus around service accounts that have domain administrative access, a little bit nuanced, but there's some insurance carriers that really don't have any appetite for service accounts that have domain admin access. Typically, it's maybe running some sort of third-party software, or it could be a firewall or something like that. From most of our clients, have been successful at reducing that number down to a very, very small number, if not zero. So a lot of times it's just challenging IT teams to be able to find that workaround. Because if they gain access to a service account that has domain admin access, they really have quite a bit of authority and ability to compromise the network. So really making sure that that is limited is really important and imperative. There's also been some recent guidance too, and I'm sure this will be something to talk about in the next session, but there's been some new guidance by Biden administration in March. Hasn't gone into effect yet, but it's been around critical infrastructure, anyone deemed critical infrastructure, which there's almost like 16 categories. So it's probably easier to figure out who is not included and who is included, but it's a lot around the notification. What's the duty? Also notifying any kind of federal authority as well. So I recently had an article that I did with Thompson Hine that's on Law 360. I can share with anybody that's interested. But really, from a regulatory environment, it's becoming more challenging. There's a lot. There's the CMMC. There's obviously the general data protection regulation with the EU, California, the New York privacy laws as well. So it's a quite an alphabet soup to navigate. So really having the right kind of legal representation for privacy and security is so critical, and being prepared for, what's your duty, what's your responsibility. Because some of them you need to provide notification within 72 hours. A lot of times 72 hours, you're just trying to figure out what happened. So really understanding and being prepared to respond as you need to is really so critical. And I find that a lot of clients, they don't understand, or, there's some cool new data, new way to access the building. We're going to implement biometrics, things like that, and not really understanding the privacy implications. So really understanding that, what is the consent? What do we need to be doing? And then there's also, especially in Ohio, there's some liability safe harbors. If you follow, some of the certain, I can't remember the exact list, but it's NIST, it's ISO, it's payment card industry, ISO 27001, where if you're following those cybersecurity frameworks, it actually provides a safe harbor for liability. So, some of these states, it's more of a stick and less of a carrot. Ohio has that more of an incentive, and some of the new legislation with regards to critical infrastructure does provide some more of an incentive to notify and really hopefully sharing that data and making sure that everyone understands to what kind of notification, what are the obligations, what kind of contractual obligations do you have with your vendors as well. So one of the things that I talked about and try to be really vigilant with our clients is starting early. It's so important. Because we know that our insurance carriers are regularly scanning as part of the underwriting process. We use a tool called BitSight for our clients. So it's a non-invasive scan of the network. It's really just based on the website. So once we put that domain in, it's able to pull anyone that is connected. And, with that information, it's a non-invasive scan of the network. So it's sort of like what the bad guys see as well. You can understand if there's unpatched software, if there's information that's been compromised in the past, and things like that. So the scan should be part of the process to learn and identify if, if your scan is not great, you may actually be denied insurance coverage without even being able to tell your story. So the scans are really important. The higher the scan, or the better that you look from the scanning process, the more opportunities and more insurance carriers that would consider your risk. So looking at that scan, and a lot of times it can take time to reflect the score. So it could take maybe up to 60 days. Patching cadence can take up to 300 days to update. So making sure that you're updating that information, scanning, understanding, what kind of vulnerabilities and where you are is really critical. I know BitSight has said that you're anywhere from 2 to 3 to 6 or 8 times more likely to have a ransomware situation if you're below a certain score. Say you're in the $3 to $400 range. I think you're almost 7 times more likely to have an incident. So they're finding that your score has a direct impact on your overall cybersecurity. And the scores, think about it in terms like a FICO score. So, but it's for cybersecurity. So it's a good way to kind of evaluate. Certainly not perfect. It's kind of like looking at a house. You can see in the windows, but you're not going to see behind the walls and the doors. So it gives a glimpse into the cybersecurity, but it's certainly not an all-encompassing picture. So starting early and actually, going through your applications with your brokers, going through the application, talking through compensating controls, so that story can be told. And if there are any questions, I also think it's really important to schedule an underwriting call. So understand who your underwriter is, have that conversation, have that comfort level too, and hopefully try and get some commitments with regards to terms, conditions, and guidelines for the renewal. And, all of that really is coupled to hopefully drive the best outcome with the side effect that you're going to hopefully become more cyber resilient by following all the best practices. Again, because the insurance carriers are asking questions, but it's specific because it's where they're seeing the claims. There's also, making sure, again, you're checking in regularly and reviewing controls with your brokers and understanding, what are the really hot button points, what's important, what isn't important, and identifying that, and maybe try and budget for your cybersecurity. So starting early is just really critical because a lot of these things can't happen overnight. It's just not possible. So if you're aware and you're armed with that data, hopefully it's going to end up being a much better outcome for your organization and, minimize any surprises as well. So with that, wrapped up a little bit early. I don't know if anybody has any questions or anything that they want to go over, or maybe they didn't fully understand. Nope.
Lacy, I have to apologize. I completely skipped doing your bio and introduction, but that is a good plug. We do have all of the summit documentation already uploaded to the CPO site. So if you guys want to go out and download all of that information, and Lacy's bio is out there for you to take a look at. She has a wealth of knowledge, at least 15 years in the insurance industry, office
Yeah.
or executives. So, any other questions? Is there anything in the chat?
I haven't been checking chat. You had it up.
I don't think we had anyone in the chat, but if anybody has any questions afterwards, I've got some fairly comprehensive renewal checklist, cyber renewal checklist with questions that we can share and some other things. So just let us know how we can help. I think one other thing I would say too is understanding who you want to work with if you have an incident. Does your IT team currently have a retainer in place? Really understanding all of that, and does it align with your insurance carrier is really important too. So I would think about it in terms of legal, crisis management, and also disaster recovery, incident response firms. Well, thank you everyone for your time. Really
Fantastic.
appreciate it.
Today, I will have yours and David's contact information available for anybody in case we have any questions and need to reach out to.
Thanks, Zach.
Fantastic.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being on. Feel free to stay.